Maria wiped the sweat from her forehead as she stirred the large pot of rice on the stove. The kitchen was filled with the aroma of garlic and onions, mixed with the smell of chicken simmering in another pot. It was Tuesday evening, and she was preparing dinner for her family of 6 in their small apartment in the heart of the city. The 28-year-old mother had developed a routine over the years. Every day at 5 in the afternoon, she would start cooking while her 3 children did their homework at the wooden table in the corner of the kitchen. Her husband wouldn't be home from his construction job for another hour, giving her just enough time to prepare a proper meal. As she chopped vegetables for the salad, Maria listened to her youngest daughter, Sophia, practicing her reading aloud. The 7-year-old struggled with some words, but Maria encouraged her with gentle corrections and praise. Her 2 older sons, Carlos and Diego, aged 10 and 12, were quietly working on their math problems. The apartment building was old but well maintained. Maria had lived here for 8 years, ever since she married Roberto. The neighbors were friendly, and the children had made good friends in the area. It felt like a safe place to raise a family, despite being in a part of the city that sometimes made the news for the wrong reasons. Maria reached for the salt when she heard a sound that made her freeze. It was a low whistling noise, growing louder by the second. She had heard that sound before, during the conflict years ago when she was a teenager living in her hometown. Her heart began to race as the whistling grew more intense. The kitchen window faced the street, and Maria could see people outside starting to look up at the sky with worried expressions. Some were pointing, while others began walking faster down the sidewalk. A car horn honked repeatedly in the distance, and she could hear shouting from somewhere nearby. Sophia stopped reading and looked up at her mother with curious eyes. Carlos and Diego had also noticed something was wrong, as their mother had suddenly become very still, her hand frozen in the air while reaching for the spice rack. The whistling sound was now so loud that it seemed to fill the entire apartment. Maria's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. Not here. Not in their peaceful neighborhood where the biggest worry was usually whether the grocery store would have fresh bread. Then she saw it through the window, a dark object moving across the sky, leaving a trail of smoke behind it. Her blood turned cold as she realized what it was. After all these years of peace, the conflict had found its way to their doorstep. The missile struck 3 blocks away with a thunderous explosion that shook their entire building. The windows rattled violently, and the dishes in the cabinet clinked together like wind chimes. The lights flickered, and for a moment everything went silent except for the ringing in Maria's ears. Sophia screamed and dropped her book. Carlos and Diego jumped up from their chairs, knocking over their pencils and papers. In the distance, car alarms began blaring, and Maria could hear people shouting in the street below. Her first instinct was to protect her children. She turned off the stove with shaking hands and rushed to gather her 3 little ones. Sophia was crying, clinging to her mother's legs, while the boys stood frozen in shock, trying to understand what had just happened. Maria's training from years ago kicked in. During her teenage years, she had learned basic emergency procedures during the previous conflict. She knew they needed to get to the safest part of the apartment, away from windows and external walls. She guided her children to the interior hallway, the strongest part of their home. As they huddled together, she could hear more explosions in the distance, each one getting closer to their neighborhood. The sound of breaking glass echoed from somewhere in the building, and she could smell smoke drifting through the air. Her phone buzzed with an emergency alert, confirming her worst fears. The city was under attack, and residents were advised to seek shelter immediately. Maria's hands trembled as she tried to call Roberto, but the call wouldn't go through. The cellular networks were probably overwhelmed or damaged. Looking at her 3 children's frightened faces, Maria knew she had to be strong. They were depending on her to keep them safe, and she couldn't let fear paralyze her. She had to think clearly and act quickly to protect her family until Roberto could get home. The woman, who had been peacefully cooking dinner just minutes earlier, was now facing the most challenging moment of her life. Everything she had built, everything she cherished, was suddenly at risk. But Maria was not going to let her family become victims without a fight. Maria held her children close in the hallway as another explosion shook the building. Dust fell from the ceiling, and she could hear the sound of sirens getting closer. Sophia was still crying, but Carlos and Diego had become quiet, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. She needed to assess their situation quickly. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a 5-story building. Going to the basement would be safer, but she didn't know if other residents were already there or if it was even accessible. More importantly, she had to consider whether Roberto would be able to find them if they moved. Maria remembered the emergency kit she had put together years ago after watching a safety program on television. It was stored in the bedroom closet, containing bottled water, non-perishable food, a first aid kit, flashlights, and a battery-powered radio. At the time, Roberto had teased her about being overly prepared, but now she was grateful for her foresight. She told the children to stay in the hallway while she quickly gathered the emergency supplies. As she moved through the apartment, she could see through the windows that smoke was rising from several locations across the city. The sky had turned an ominous orange color, and she could hear helicopters flying overhead. When she returned to the hallway with the emergency kit and some blankets, she found her neighbors, the elderly couple from next door, standing in their doorway, looking confused and scared. Mr. and Mrs. Chen had lived in the building longer than anyone and had always been kind to Maria's family. Mrs. Chen was having trouble walking due to her arthritis, and her husband looked frail and disoriented. Maria realized that they would need help getting to safety. Without hesitation, she invited them into her apartment, knowing that they would be safer together than alone. As they all huddled in the hallway, Maria turned on the battery-powered radio to get information about what was happening. The emergency broadcasts were chaotic, with reports of multiple strikes across different parts of the city. The authorities were urging everyone to stay indoors and away from windows. Carlos, her 10-year-old, suddenly spoke up with a maturity that surprised his mother. He suggested they should gather all the food and water they could find and bring it to their safe spot. Diego nodded in agreement and offered to help carry supplies. Maria was proud of how her sons were handling the crisis. She organized them into a small team, with Carlos helping Mr. Chen sit comfortably while Diego helped her gather additional supplies from the kitchen. Sophia stayed close to Mrs. Chen, who was trying to comfort the little girl despite her own fear. As they worked together, Maria heard footsteps in the stairwell and voices calling out. She cautiously approached the door and looked through the peephole. It was their downstairs neighbor, a single mother named Anna who lived with her teenage daughter. Anna was crying and asking if anyone could help her. Her daughter had been at school when the attack started, and she hadn't been able to reach her. The schools were on lockdown, but Anna was desperate to know if her child was safe. Maria opened the door and immediately brought Anna into their group. She understood the mother's panic and promised they would try to get information about the schools once the radio provided updates. Having Anna with them actually made Maria feel more secure, as there was strength in numbers. The group now consisted of 8 people in the small hallway. Maria took charge naturally, organizing their supplies and making sure everyone had water. She used the first aid kit to treat a small cut on Mrs. Chen's hand from a piece of broken glass. Through the radio, they learned that the attacks were part of a larger conflict that had been brewing for months. The government was responding, but citizens were advised to remain in secure locations until the all-clear was given. The broadcaster mentioned that emergency shelters were being set up, but reaching them would be dangerous given the ongoing strikes. Maria made the decision that they would stay put for now. Moving with elderly neighbors and small children during active attacks would be too risky. Their hallway was structurally sound, and they had enough supplies to last at least a day or two. As the evening progressed, the explosions became less frequent, but the group could still hear distant gunfire and the sounds of emergency vehicles racing through the streets. Maria organized a rotation where adults would take turns staying awake to monitor the radio and watch for any signs of immediate danger. Despite the terrifying circumstances, the group began to function like a small family. The children helped distribute snacks, the adults shared stories to keep spirits up, and everyone contributed to making their temporary shelter as comfortable as possible. Maria couldn't stop thinking about Roberto. She prayed he was safe and had found shelter at his work site. She also worried about their extended family living in other parts of the city. But for now, her focus had to be on the people depending on her in this moment. As night fell, the attacks seemed to pause. Maria used this quiet time to check their supplies and plan for the next day. She realized that her quick thinking and preparation had not only saved her own family but had also created a safe haven for their neighbors. The woman who had been cooking a simple dinner just hours earlier had become the leader of a small group of survivors, making decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for 8 people. The night passed slowly, with everyone taking turns sleeping while others kept watch. Maria had barely slept, constantly listening to the radio for updates and checking on the group. When morning came, the city seemed eerily quiet, broken only by the distant sound of emergency vehicles and military trucks moving through the streets. The radio announced that a temporary ceasefire had been established to allow for humanitarian aid and evacuation of civilians from the most affected areas. However, residents were still advised to remain in secure locations until official evacuation routes could be established. Maria looked around at her makeshift family. Mrs. Chen's arthritis had worsened during the night from sleeping on the hard floor, and Mr. Chen seemed confused and kept asking about their cat, which was still somewhere in their apartment. Anna hadn't slept at all, constantly worrying about her daughter at the school. The children were hungry and scared, but trying to be brave. When Maria checked their supplies, she realized they were running low on water and food faster than expected. 8 people were consuming resources much quicker than she had planned for her family of 5. She needed to make some difficult decisions about rationing, while also considering the special needs of the elderly couple and the children. Around mid-morning, they heard voices in the stairwell again. This time it was a group of residents from the upper floors who had decided to try to reach the basement shelter. They invited Maria's group to join them, saying that the basement would be safer and might have access to additional supplies. Maria faced a crucial decision. Moving the group, especially with Mrs. Chen's limited mobility and her own 3 young children, would be risky, but staying in the hallway with dwindling supplies might be worse. She gathered the adults and discussed their options quietly, not wanting to frighten the children. After much consideration, they decided to attempt the move to the basement. Maria organized the group carefully, with the older boys helping Mr. and Mrs. Chen while she carried Sophia. Anna would help carry supplies, and they would move slowly and quietly down the stairs. As they made their way down, Maria was shocked by what she saw. Several apartments had broken windows and debris littered the stairwell. The building had suffered more damage than she had realized from their protected position in the hallway. When they reached the basement, they found about 15 other residents who had been there since the attacks began. The space was cramped but felt more secure. There was a small storage room with some emergency supplies that the building management had kept, including additional water and basic medical supplies. However, the basement also brought new challenges. The space was not well ventilated, and with so many people, it was becoming stuffy and uncomfortable. There was also tension among some of the residents about how to share the limited resources and whether they should try to leave the building to reach official shelters. Maria found herself becoming an unofficial mediator between different groups of residents. Her calm demeanor and practical approach during the crisis had earned the respect of others. When disputes arose about food distribution or sleeping arrangements, people looked to her for solutions. One of the most difficult moments came when they discovered that the building's water supply had been damaged in the attacks. The taps were producing only a trickle of brownish water that was clearly not safe to drink. This meant their bottled water supplies would run out much sooner than anticipated. Maria suggested they create a system for collecting rainwater and melting snow from outside, but this would require someone to venture out of the basement periodically. Despite the risks, she volunteered to take on this dangerous task, knowing that her children needed water to survive. The other residents were amazed by Maria's courage and selflessness. While others argued or complained about their situation, she continued to find practical solutions and put the needs of the most vulnerable first. Her actions were inspiring others to be more cooperative and helpful. Late in the afternoon, they received radio reports that government forces were gaining control of several areas of the city, but fighting was still intense in other neighborhoods. Emergency shelters were being established, but reaching them would require coordinating with military escorts. Anna finally received word through emergency communications that her daughter was safe at the school, which had been converted into a temporary shelter. This news brought tears of relief not just to Anna, but to everyone in the basement who had been worried about the girl's safety. As evening approached, Maria realized they were facing another night in the basement with even fewer supplies than before. She had been quietly rationing her own family's food to ensure the elderly neighbors and other children had enough to eat. Her own children had noticed but hadn't complained, understanding that others needed help. The group had grown closer throughout the day, sharing stories, helping with each other's children, and working together to solve problems. Maria had not only kept her own family safe, but had become a source of strength and hope for an entire community of survivors. When someone suggested they should elect a leader to help organize their group better, Maria was chosen unanimously. She accepted the responsibility, knowing that the decision she made could affect the lives of more than 20 people who were now depending on her wisdom and courage. The attacks had transformed a simple mother and homemaker into a community leader, making life and death decisions and keeping hope alive in the darkest of circumstances. On the second morning in the basement, Maria made a decision that would shock everyone. Despite the ongoing danger and her responsibilities to the group, she announced that she was going to venture outside to search for additional supplies and attempt to contact the authorities about their situation. The other residents protested immediately. They argued it was too dangerous, that she was needed in the basement, and that someone else should take the risk. But Maria had been listening to the radio reports and realized that help wasn't coming to them quickly enough. If they waited much longer, the children and elderly residents would suffer serious health consequences from dehydration and lack of proper food. She had spent the night developing a plan. During the radio broadcasts, she had noted the locations of emergency supply distribution points that had been set up around the city. One of these points was only 6 blocks away from their building. If she could reach it and explain their situation, she might be able to bring back essential supplies and get their location added to the priority list for evacuation. Maria knew the risks. The streets were still dangerous, with occasional sniper fire and unexploded debris. There were reports of civilian casualties from people who had tried to move between buildings. But she also knew that staying in the basement without adequate supplies was becoming increasingly dangerous, especially for Mrs. Chen, whose health was deteriorating. She spent an hour preparing for the mission, studying a map of the neighborhood and planning the safest route to the supply point. She would travel light, carrying only a small backpack with identification and a list of all the people in their group. Her plan was to move quickly, staying close to buildings and avoiding open spaces. Before leaving, Maria gathered her children and explained what she was doing. Carlos and Diego, now understanding the gravity of their situation, begged to come with her. But she explained that they were needed in the basement to help take care of the other residents, especially Sophia and the elderly neighbors. She asked Anna to watch over her children while she was gone, and instructed the older boys to help distribute water and food according to the rationing schedule she had established. Maria also left detailed instructions about what to do if she didn't return within 6 hours. The moment Maria stepped outside the building was terrifying. The familiar neighborhood looked like a war zone. Windows were shattered, debris covered the streets, and several cars had been abandoned or destroyed. The silence was broken only by distant sounds of helicopters and occasional gunfire from across the city. She began moving carefully along the predetermined route, staying close to building walls and ducking into doorways whenever she heard aircraft overhead. The 6-block journey that normally would take 15 minutes ended up taking over an hour as she navigated around damaged areas and waited for safe opportunities to cross streets. When Maria finally reached the emergency supply point, she was amazed by what she found. It was a well-organized operation run by military personnel and aid workers. There were medical tents, food distribution areas, and communication stations where people could try to contact missing family members. The aid workers were initially skeptical when Maria explained her situation. Many people had been trying to get extra supplies by claiming to represent larger groups than they actually did. But Maria's detailed list of residents, including their ages and medical conditions, convinced them that her story was genuine. What happened next surprised even Maria herself. Instead of just giving her supplies to take back, the aid workers decided that her group's location should be prioritized for evacuation. A military officer explained that they had been looking for intact buildings with organized groups of civilians to establish as temporary safe zones. Maria's leadership and the fact that her group included elderly residents and young children made their basement an ideal candidate for official protection. The officer told her that within 24 hours, military personnel would arrive to establish a secure perimeter around their building and provide ongoing supplies. But there was a catch. Maria would need to return to the basement immediately, and help prepare the group for the arrival of military personnel. She would also need to maintain order and ensure that residents followed specific protocols that would be essential for their safety and the success of the operation. The aid workers loaded her backpack with medical supplies, high-energy food bars, and water purification tablets. They also gave her a two-way radio that would allow her to communicate directly with the command center. Maria had become not just a group leader, but an official liaison between her community and the emergency response authorities. The return journey to the building was even more challenging because she was now carrying additional weight and was exhausted from the stress and physical demands of the morning. But the knowledge that help was coming gave her the strength to push through. When Maria arrived back at the basement, the relief and joy on everyone's faces was overwhelming. The children ran to hug her, and even the adults who had initially opposed her mission admitted they were amazed by what she had accomplished. She immediately began organizing the group according to the protocols she had learned at the supply point. They would need to have everyone's identification ready, establish clear communication procedures, and prepare the basement to serve as a temporary processing center for other civilians in the area. As word spread through the building that their basement was becoming an official safe zone, more residents began joining their group. Maria found herself responsible for an even larger community, but she now had the resources and official support to handle the challenge. The woman who had risked everything to save her group had not only succeeded in her mission but had transformed their desperate situation into a beacon of hope for the entire neighborhood. Her courage had shocked everyone, including herself, but it had also saved lives and created something much larger than anyone had imagined possible. True to their promise, military personnel arrived at the building exactly 24 hours after Maria's return from the supply point. A squad of 6 soldiers led by Sergeant Rodriguez established a security perimeter around the building and began converting the basement into an official civilian safe zone. Maria found herself working directly with military planners to coordinate the transformation of their makeshift shelter into something much more significant. What had started as a desperate gathering of neighbors had become a model operation that military commanders wanted to replicate in other parts of the city. The basement was expanded to include the building's storage areas and part of the ground floor. Military engineers brought in proper lighting, ventilation equipment, and communication systems. Medical personnel arrived to provide proper care for Mrs. Chen and other residents who needed attention. But the most surprising development was when Sergeant Rodriguez informed Maria that her actions had been reported up the chain of command. Military leaders were so impressed by her leadership and the successful organization of civilian survivors that they wanted to offer her a formal position as a civilian coordinator for other safe zone operations. This opportunity would mean working with military teams across the city to help establish and manage safe zones in other neighborhoods. It would also mean training other civilians to take on leadership roles in emergency situations. Maria would essentially become a bridge between military operations and civilian communities. The decision was incredibly difficult for Maria. Accepting the position would mean leaving her children in the care of others, while she worked in dangerous areas of the city. But it would also mean potentially saving hundreds or even thousands of lives by sharing what she had learned about organizing civilian survival groups. Roberto finally arrived at the safe zone on the 3rd day after the attacks began. He had been trapped at his construction site when the attacks started and had spent days trying to navigate through military checkpoints and damaged areas to reach his family. When he saw what Maria had accomplished, he was both amazed and overwhelmed with pride. The reunion was emotional for the entire group. Roberto's arrival brought a sense of completeness to their improvised family, and his construction skills were immediately put to use, improving their living conditions. But Roberto also brought news from other parts of the city that made Maria realize how unique their situation had become. According to Roberto, most civilian groups were struggling without proper organization or leadership. Many people were still trapped in dangerous areas without adequate supplies or communication with authorities. The safe zone model that Maria had helped develop was working so well that military commanders wanted to expand it rapidly to other locations. After long discussions with Roberto and the other adults in their group, Maria made her decision. She would accept the position as civilian coordinator, but only if her family could move to a more secure location. and only if she could continue working with the team that had become like extended family to her. The military agreed to her conditions. Maria's entire group, including the elderly neighbors and Anna with her daughter who had been reunited with them, would be relocated to a central safe zone that served as headquarters for civilian coordination operations. From there, Maria would travel to other neighborhoods to help establish new safe zones while her family remained in a secure environment. Her first assignment as civilian coordinator took her to a neighborhood where 30 families were trapped in an underground parking garage without proper supplies or organization. Using the experience she had gained in her own basement, Maria spent 3 days helping them establish leadership structures, organize resources, and coordinate with military support teams. The success of this operation led to more assignments. Over the following weeks, Maria found herself working in various parts of the city, helping communities that had been written off as hopeless cases. Her ability to quickly assess group dynamics, identify natural leaders, and establish practical systems for survival became legendary among both civilian and military personnel. What surprised everyone, including Maria herself, was how naturally she had adapted to this new role. The skills she had developed as a mother and homemaker translated perfectly to managing large groups of people under stress. Her ability to remain calm under pressure, make difficult decisions quickly, and prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable made her incredibly effective in crisis situations. Within a month of the attacks, Maria had helped establish 12 successful safe zones housing over 800 civilians. Military reports credited her methods with significantly reducing civilian casualties and improving the efficiency of humanitarian operations throughout the city. The most remarkable aspect of Maria's transformation was that she never lost sight of her original motivation. Every decision she made, every risk she took, was driven by the same protective instinct that had led her to shield her children in that hallway on the first night of the attacks. Her reputation spread beyond military circles. Other cities facing similar conflicts began requesting assistance from Maria's team to help establish their own civilian coordination programs. What had started as a mother protecting her family had evolved into a model for civilian leadership in crisis situations that was being studied and implemented around the world. Roberto often marveled at how the woman who had been cooking dinner that Tuesday evening had become someone whose actions were affecting the lives of thousands of people. But to Maria, the connection was clear. Everything she did was still about protecting families, just on a much larger scale than she had ever imagined possible. 6 months after the attacks, the conflict had ended, and the city was beginning the long process of reconstruction. Maria's work as civilian coordinator had evolved into something no one could have predicted. She had become the director of the newly established Emergency Community Response Institute, an organization dedicated to training civilians for crisis leadership roles. The institute was housed in a renovated building near the city center, and Maria found herself working with government officials, military leaders, and international aid organizations to develop programs that could be implemented in communities around the world. Her basement experience had become the foundation for a new approach to civilian emergency management. What made Maria's story truly remarkable was not just her transformation from homemaker to international crisis management expert, but how she had maintained her family connections and values throughout the process. Roberto had become her closest advisor, bringing his practical construction experience to help design better emergency shelters and safe zones. Carlos and Diego, now 11 and 13, had become junior ambassadors for the Institute's youth preparedness programs. Their first-hand experience of the crisis, combined with their mother's guidance, made them effective teachers for other children learning emergency skills. Sophia, now 8, had developed a remarkable ability to comfort younger children during emergency drills and training exercises. The Chen family had remained close to Maria's family. Throughout the recovery period, Mrs. Chen's health had improved significantly once proper medical care became available, and she had become a volunteer coordinator for elderly residents in emergency preparedness programs. Mr. Chen used his accounting background to help manage the Institute's finances and resource allocation. Anna and her daughter had also stayed connected to the group. Anna had returned to her job as a nurse but now specialized in trauma counseling for families affected by conflicts. Her daughter had become one of the first graduates of the Institute's teen leadership program and was planning to study emergency management in college. The most surprising development came when international media began covering Maria's story. Documentary filmmakers, journalists, and researchers from around the world wanted to understand how an ordinary mother had created such an effective model for civilian crisis response. Maria was initially uncomfortable with the attention, preferring to focus on practical work rather than publicity. However, she soon realized that sharing her story could help save lives in other places facing similar challenges. She began traveling internationally to speak at conferences and train emergency management professionals. Her presentations always emphasized that effective crisis leadership could emerge from anyone willing to put the needs of others first. The Institute's training programs were being implemented in over 20 countries by the time of the first anniversary of the attacks. Maria's methods had been adapted for different cultures and types of emergencies, from natural disasters to terrorist attacks to refugee situations. The core principles she had developed in her basement were proving to be universally applicable. One of the most meaningful projects for Maria was the development of family emergency preparedness programs. She never forgot how her simple emergency kit and basic knowledge had made the difference between survival and tragedy. The Institute now provided free emergency kits and training to families throughout the region, with a special focus on helping mothers develop confidence in their ability to protect their families. On the anniversary of the attacks, the city held a ceremony honoring civilian heroes from the crisis period. Maria was asked to speak at the event, representing all the ordinary citizens who had shown extraordinary courage during the darkest days. Standing before thousands of people, she reflected on how much had changed since that Tuesday evening when she was simply cooking dinner for her family. In her speech, Maria emphasized that heroism wasn't about being fearless or having special training. It was about caring enough about others to act despite fear and being willing to take responsibility when others needed leadership. She pointed out that every person in the audience had the same capacity for courage and leadership that circumstances had revealed in her. The most emotional moment of the ceremony came when Sergeant Rodriguez, who had worked with Maria to establish the first safe zone, presented her with a special recognition from military leadership. He credited her civilian coordination model with saving more lives than any single military operation during the conflict. After the ceremony, Maria returned home to the new house where her family now lived. It was larger than their old apartment and had a specially designed emergency shelter in the basement, but Maria had insisted on keeping a similar kitchen layout. She still cooked dinner for her family most evenings, though now Roberto and the children often helped with the preparation. As she stood in her kitchen that anniversary evening, preparing a meal while her family shared stories from their day, Maria sometimes found it hard to believe how much had changed. But she also recognized that in the most important ways, nothing had changed at all. She was still a mother protecting her family, just as she had been on that first night of the attacks. The difference was that her definition of family had expanded to include thousands of people around the world who were better prepared for emergencies because of the programs she had helped develop. The woman who had been cooking dinner when the enemy struck had discovered that her greatest strength was not just protecting her own children, but teaching others how to protect theirs. Years later, when people asked Maria what had motivated her transformation from homemaker to international crisis management expert, her answer was always simple. She had never stopped being a mother. Everything else had just grown from that foundation.